All right, so we've got quite a bit to dig into for this deep dive. You've given me these excerpts from Jiu Jitsu Unleashed, which is awesome, and I'm really looking forward to picking this apart with you. I know you're familiar with this. And the goal here, as always, is to take a look at Eddie Bravo's very interesting approach to Jiu Jitsu.
Yeah, I think Eddie Bravo is such a fascinating innovator in the jiu-jitsu world. And, Jiu-Jitsu Unleashed, I mean, it's kind of a classic, right? It really gives a window into this guy's, his techniques and his thinking.
Absolutely.
For people who might not be familiar with Eddie Bravo, he's known for his very innovative techniques, particularly in no-gi grappling.
Right.
And the book actually has a foreword from Joe Rogan, Joe Rogan from NBC's Fear Factor.
Yeah, of course.
And Rogan talks about how creative a mind Bravo has and how this book could really impact the art of jiu-jitsu.
Totally. And I'm excited to dive in because I know you're interested in really getting a deep understanding of this kind of thing without getting bogged down in too many details.
Right.
So our mission here is to kind of look at those core ideas in this book and some of those key techniques that he introduces. We really want to get to those aha moments that make things click for you, without just overwhelming you with a ton of information.
Yeah, totally. And looking at what you've pulled from the book, there's a lot here.
Yeah.
We're going to trace Bravo's journey in jiu-jitsu,
Okay.
like his early experiences and how his distinctive style emerged. We're going to look at the whole gi versus no-gi debate,
Yes.
the principles of 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu, and then those specifics of the guard and control positions, the half guard, rubber guard, twister side control, and the mount. And crucially, those transitions between them.
Awesome. So let's just dive right in then. Right from the get-go, the book gives us a glimpse into Eddie Bravo's evolution in martial arts. So he starts with Zenduru karate.
Right.
But what really seemed to spark this deep interest in grappling was an event that he describes on page 2, where he sees some friends of his get into a bad situation, and he kind of realizes in that moment that being able to control someone on the ground, offers this capability that striking alone just doesn't.
Yeah, what I think is really insightful is it's a real-world scenario.
Exact.
It wasn't just a theoretical interest in grappling. It was seeing the practicality of it in a way that really resonated with him personally.
Right, and the book talks about his initial experiences with traditional jiu-jitsu and his time training at the Machado Academy, which is pages 4 through 6. And he mentions even finding certain techniques challenging at first.
Yeah.
The twister, for instance, being one. But this is what's so interesting. This early difficulty, it didn't really set him back. It fueled this desire to find his own solutions.
That is just so Eddie Bravo, though, isn't
Yeah.
it? I mean, that is like a central theme in his whole approach, right? A willingness to question and evolve.
Right.
He wasn't content just to copy techniques if he didn't fully get them or he thought they weren't optimally effective, especially in no-quite situations.
Right. And that leads us directly into his observations about the differences between gi and no-gi competition. And he particularly talks about this in the early UFC events, which is around pages 6 and 7. And what he saw was a real strategic shift. Without the gi, the traditional grips and controls that gi jiu-jitsu relies on became less reliable.
Right.
He saw a real advantage in prioritizing controls like overhooks and underhooks when people weren't wearing the gi. And this observation really shaped his training.
And, if we kind of zoom out and look at the big picture here, the early UFC, it really underscored how grappling had to adapt to a no-gi context.
Right.
Fighters needed to be effective when they couldn't grab fabric. And Bravo was obviously watching this really carefully.
Right.
His emphasis on these specific controls was a direct response to what he was seeing in those fights.
Totally. And we can see this focus in action when we get to his participation in the 2003 Abu Dhabi qualifiers and World Championships. That's talked about on page 13 and then more in detail on pages 18 through 22. And he specifically discusses his use of the rubber guard, which we'll get into, and other no-gi techniques in these competitions. So it wasn't just theoretical. He was actively testing this against high-level opponents.
Yeah, and this is a really significant period because it shows that he was serious about this. It wasn't just talk. He was putting it to the test.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, succeeding against more conventionally trained jiu-jitsu players.
That's awesome. And that leads us to the whole gi versus no gi discussion, which is pages 22 through 24.
Okay.
And the book really lays out these two viewpoints about whether gi training is essential for jiu-jitsu practitioners.
Hmm.
One side, as you know, as it's presented in the book, says mastering grappling with the gi gives you this fundamental understanding of leverage and control that benefits every aspect of jiu-jitsu.
Right. And the other side, and this is the side that Bravo is more on, sees no-gi as its own distinct and equally valid discipline. And the argument there is that no-gi grappling has this completely unique set of techniques and strategies. And it's especially effective for MMA, where, of course, you're not wearing a gi. It changes the dynamic so much.
Right. Bravo offers his take on page 23. He sees no-gi as this significant and natural evolution within jiu-jitsu. While he acknowledges the history and value of gi training, he clearly believes in the significance of a strong no-gi game.
And that raises a really important question for people who are involved in jiu-jitsu.
Well,
How do you balance the training between the two?
exactly.
The book presents them as distinct paths, but they're not necessarily exclusive. So I think the ideal balance comes down to what your individual goals are.
Right.
And the situations where you plan on using your skills.
That makes perfect sense. Then the book goes into the philosophy behind 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu, which is on pages 24 and 25.
Okay.
And Bravo kind of introduces this concept. It's almost like its own planet. It's so distinct within the jiu-jitsu world because of its unique characteristics and approach.
And what's really insightful here is this emphasis on evolution and innovation in techniques. 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu isn't about tradition.
Right.
It's about looking for the best and newest ways to grapple.
Right.
And adapting to the changing landscape of the art. And this really goes back to him struggling with the traditional twister.
Right.
And then developing his own variations and systems from that struggle.
Exactly. So it's this fundamental mindset of constant improvement, adaptation, and a willingness to just try new things. And that seems to be at the core of the 10th Planet philosophy.
Right.
So let's dig into some of these specific guard systems. Okay, so we're going to start with the half guard, which is covered in chapter 1. That starts on page 27. Now, for those who might not be too familiar with jiu-jitsu, the half guard is where you're on your back, but you've got one of your opponent's legs trapped between yours. And Bravo emphasizes that this is so crucial because it's easier to get to than full guard.
Right.
And it often serves as a starting point for sweeps and submissions.
So with the half guard, the key, and he explains this on page 28, is to control that one trapped leg.
Okay.
And use underhooks to control their upper body. And then there's the lockdown. The lockdown is where you're using your legs to tightly control that trapped leg.
Right.
And creating leverage. What I think is so interesting is that Bravo doesn't see this as a defensive position.
Right.
He sees this as an offensive opportunity.
Okay, so the half guard is not just about surviving, it's about launching attacks.
Exactly.
I like that. And the book gets into a bunch of different sweeps that you can do from the half guard.
Right.
We see the old school sweep and the plan B sweep. That's on pages 32 through 35. And then some more like the half and the half and twist. That's on pages 38 through 41. And these really show how the half guard can be used to get you back on top.
What's interesting to you about these half guard techniques, it's all about disrupting balance and using the leverage you get from just that single leg. It just shows that even a compromised position can be really powerful if you understand how it works.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so then we have the rubber guard, which is chapter 2, starting on page 61.
Yeah, this is classic Eddie Bravo right here.
Yeah, he really developed this guard system to deal with those no-gi situations when you don't have those traditional collar and sleeve grips that you get with the guy.
Right, and the rubber guard, as he says on page 64, is all about using flexibility in your hips and legs. You need that.
Okay.
And this really specific kind of leg control. The goal is to control your opponent's posture so they can't pass your guard or strike.
Right.
While you're also creating those openings for submissions. You have to be really flexible, though, to make this guard work.
Right. And he introduces mission control on page 65, which is like a foundational element of the rubber guard. From this position, he outlines a ton of submissions, including the overhook omoplata and the duda, which are on pages 70 through 72. He even mentions the invisible collar on page 85, and these are some really unique and unexpected submissions that can catch your opponent off guard.
You know what's so cool about the rubber guard?
Yeah.
It totally shifts the way we think about the guard in jiu-jitsu.
Oh, so?
Instead of just stopping your opponent from passing, it's actively trying to create submissions.
Wow.
By controlling their upper body with your legs.
Yeah.
It's a much more active and offensive approach to playing guard.
I like that. Okay, so then we move on to chapter 3, which introduces twister side control. That starts on page 101.
Okay.
Bravo explains that this comes from wrestling and has this very specific and maybe a little bit less common application in jiu-jitsu.
Right.
He says on page 102 that a lot of traditional jiu-jitsu players might not have even encountered it, which can be an advantage in competition.
Of course.
So the keys to twister side control, this is on page 103, is back control principles,
Okay.
which you use to transition into the position. And timing is key to making that transition work.
Yeah.
And the control you get from this is really unorthodox.
Right.
And the goal is to isolate and control the opponent's upper body, particularly their shoulder and neck.
That's a nasty one.
And then he gets into specific variations of the twister. You've got the banana split and the crotch ripper. Those are on pages 108 through 114.
The names are pretty intense.
Yeah, the names alone let you know that this is a painful submission.
Right.
This really shows Bravo's willingness to look outside of jiu-jitsu for effective techniques
Right.
and adapt them to nogi. And the fact that a lot of people aren't familiar with this can be a big tactical advantage.
Oh, for sure.
All right, moving on to chapter 4. This one's the mount. It starts on page 123. This is a position that pretty much anyone who knows jiu-jitsu knows. It's a very dominant position.
Right.
Now, the core principles for controlling the mount, this is according to the book on page 125, they include having a good guard to fall back on, just in case you lose the mount, maintaining your balance on top so you don't get bucked off,
Right.
and using head and arm control to stop your opponent from moving and create those openings for submissions.
Makes sense.
And the book goes over some of those submissions you can do from the mount, like the arm par. That's on page 134. Even though the mount is a very basic position, Bravo really emphasizes how important it is to maintain it properly so you can open up those submissions.
It's interesting that he includes the mount, you know?
Wait, why is that?
I mean, he's really known for his guard work, but he also clearly values those fundamental, powerful top control positions. It shows that his approach isn't just about being different. It's about being strategically effective.
Right.
In all areas.
Totally. Okay, so finally, we get to chapter 7, which talks about transitions. That's on page 167. Now, the book emphasizes that smooth transitions between positions are super important in jiu-jitsu to avoid getting stuck and to open up submissions or escapes.
Yeah, and what I think is so insightful here is this understanding that jiu-jitsu has to flow.
Yeah.
You know it's dynamic. You can't just stay in one position.
Exactly.
You've got to be able to seamlessly move between them.
Totally. And so he gives specific examples of transitions like back to the twister and the swim move, invisible collar to spiderweb. Those are on pages 176 and 179. And these just show how these smooth movements can create submissions or escapes.
Right.
What I found really interesting here is how connected all of these techniques are. You know, it's not just a bunch of random moves. It's like this whole system where different guards and controls can flow together strategically.
That's it. And this emphasis on transitions really reinforces how important it is to be well-rounded and adaptable. You can't just rely on one position or one submission. You need to be able to move smoothly between them.
Right. So to recap our little deep dive into Jiu Jitsu Unleashed, we looked at Eddie Bravo's own journey and how his focus on no-gi came about from those early observations and competitions.
Right.
We touched on the gi versus no-gi debate and the ideas of 10th Planet Jiu-Jitsu with that focus on innovation. And then we got into some of those key guard systems, half guard, rubber guard, and twister side control, as well as the mount, and how crucial smooth transitions are.
And I think for you, the listener, understanding these concepts can really help you grasp this area of jiu-jitsu. Hopefully you got those aha moments.
Right.
And now have a better understanding without feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah. It really gives you a glimpse into a very innovative way of thinking about jiu-jitsu. So here's a final thought for you. Given Bravo's emphasis on innovation and adapting techniques, like from wrestling, what other martial arts principles or even just movement patterns could have potential for jiu-jitsu?
That's a good one. Or maybe think about how the growth of no-gi competition, both in MMA and submission grappling, will shape jiu-jitsu in the future.
That's a good one. It shows that martial arts are always evolving.
Yeah, for sure.
And the search for better techniques never ends.
That's jiu-jitsu.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Of course.
And we'll catch you next time.